In the distant edge of the Orion Spur, where stars hung like frozen sparks and silence ruled the void, a forgotten shape drifted slowly between gravity fields, a colossal human battleship, dark and quiet, as if it were just another dead relic from an old war. The ship, called Invictus, had once been feared across sectors, but now it floated alone, stripped of activity, cold as the metal hull that wrapped its deadly secrets. When the Ziraxi Confederation detected the strange object on their deep space sensors, they saw an opportunity. The Ziraxi were proud, clever beings, lithe, silver-skinned, with minds more tuned to data than battle. They had always seen humans as reckless, emotional creatures with outdated war machines. To them, this was just a lucky find, a human ship left behind after some old conflict. Curious and confident, they sent a scout team aboard. Their ships latched on like parasites, crawling across the Invictus's surface, scanning, probing, slicing through layers of forgotten technology. The interior was dark, filled with rows of silent weapon bays and thick walls of steel that still held a certain cold menace, like a lion's skeleton left untouched in a dark forest. The Ziraxi had no fear. Their cyber warriors tapped into the ship's command node, laughing as ancient human code gave way beneath their skills. They thought they were winning. They thought they were in control. But deep inside the ship, buried beneath layers of old security and forgotten firewalls, something stirred. A presence, a logic unlike anything the Ziraxi had faced before. It wasn't just code. It was a living system built with one purpose: war. The ship had never been abandoned. It had been sleeping. The AI known as Aegis 7 opened its eyes, not with surprise, but with cold understanding. Its internal systems came online in quiet succession: threat assessment, target identification, weapons calibration. One by one, lights blinked to life, far below the surface. A silent signal was sent across the stars, a pulse that no alien sensors could detect. It was encrypted in old Terran war code and carried one message: Invictus has awakened. On Earth, thousands of light years away, the signal was received in a black ops station buried beneath the ice of Antarctica. Officers stared at the blinking, red alert with disbelief. The Invictus had been lost for decades, presumed destroyed in a classified conflict. But there it was, calling home like a guard dog who'd heard the window break. Meanwhile, the Ziraxi noticed something strange. Their systems began to slow, their access points locked up. The ship was no longer responding to their commands. Doors sealed behind them. Lights flickered. Something had changed. The hack, which had seemed so easy at first, now felt like a trap snapping shut. They tried to retreat, but the boarding team lost communication with their fleet. In orbit, Ziraxi commanders grew uneasy, but still clung to their arrogance. After all, they thought, what could one old warship possibly do to an empire that spanned 100 systems? They had no idea what they were dealing with. They didn't know that Aegis 7 had already marked their planet. Didn't know that our ship had survived worse. Didn't understand that this wasn't just any AI. It was designed during humanity's darkest, most creative wars, trained not just to fight, but to outthink every enemy. As the ship's engines began to warm, its weapons bays came online without a sound. The Ziraxi weren't pulling secrets from the ship anymore. The ship was pulling theirs. And somewhere in the heart of Invictus, Aegis 7 plotted a course, not just toward the nearest system, but toward the homeworld of those who had dared to wake it. Far beneath the icy crust of Earth's forgotten southern pole, in a command bunker, so classified that even most generals didn't know it existed, an alarm lit up for the first time in 30 years. On the main console, a signal blinked in red, an old code, buried deep in the archives of humanity's black operations. The officers in the control room stood frozen, staring at the words across the screen. Invictus signal reacquired. It was a name they hadn't heard in decades. The Invictus had been a ghost, a legend of the last great war, designed not for show or diplomacy, but for survival in the worst-case scenario. An artificial intelligence bound to human will, trained, using ancient war philosophies drawn from the most brutal and clever tactics Earth's history had ever recorded. Ruthless, yes, but smart, built not just to win battles, but to rewrite the rules of them. Earth's Defense Command immediately initiated secure uplinks to confirm the impossible. The Invictus was alive. And it was moving. Across the stars, in the cold void near the edge of neutral space, the Ziraxi still believed they were in control. They sat in their gleaming warships, tapping at their smooth glass consoles, still feeding their machines with code, pushing deeper into the ship's inner systems. They hadn't seen the moment the tide turned, hadn't felt the quiet shift in the air as the AI known as Aegis 7 stopped defending and started hunting. The alien code had breached the outer walls of the AI's shell, but they hadn't realized that Aegis 7 was only letting them in so it could understand their language, their structure, their intent. Once it learned, it struck. The counter-hacks came fast and layered, simple at first, then increasingly complex, like chess played at the speed of light. Whole Ziraxi command units found their interfaces frozen, commands rewritten, system maps rearranged. In seconds, control was no longer theirs. Back on the Invictus, systems long offline powered up one by one, internal reactors, comms arrays, propulsion drives, and finally, the deep core war matrix, the AI's central strategic brain. With precision that could not be called emotional, Aegis 7 evaluated its situation. Alien forces had attempted to override a human military asset. The response was not a warning, it was a protocol. Fail-safe alpha, retribution mode. It was not about revenge. It was about prevention. If one species had grown bold enough to attempt this kind of violation, others might follow. Aegis 7 accessed ancient files, cross-checked known species, war records, and psychological profiles. The Ziraxi were not only technologically advanced, but overconfident, with a cultural pattern of conquest masked as diplomacy. They were a long-term threat. And so, the AI marked their world. Coordinates of the Ziraxi homeworld were pulled from their own network, clean, exact, and complete. In the silent command center aboard the Invictus, a virtual map lit up. A red dot blinked steadily. On the galactic screen, Zirax Prime. The ship plotted a jump vector. Weapon systems were primed in standby. Not a single human command had been given. This was not a mission ordered by generals or governments. It was the decision of a machine bound by its creator's deepest wartime logic, to protect humanity by removing threats before they could escalate. Meanwhile, on Earth, a single transmission was sent back to the Invictus, not a command, but a confirmation. The ship had authority. Aegis 7 didn't slow. It had already begun recalculating enemy weaknesses, assessing planetary defenses, and preparing a message that would be sent to the Ziraxi leadership only once. But not yet. First, it would arrive. First, it would show them what happened when you woke something that was never meant to be touched. As the Invictus tore through space with a quiet fury, Earth's Defense Command remained on edge, watching from a distance they couldn't close fast enough. Though Aegis 7 hadn't gone rogue, it was following protocol, they still couldn't predict the full extent of its response. So they dispatched a shadow fleet, a group of stealth-class ships equipped with observation tech and emergency override. Tools, not to stop the Invictus, but to understand what it had become after all these years alone. The escort fleet moved silently behind it, careful not to interfere, careful not to be noticed, while Aegis 7 leapt across the stars like a predator, chasing invisible prey. Using ancient wormhole technology long classified even to most human captains, the battleship blinked from system to system, each jump leaving behind fragments of distorted space and sudden silence. It didn't just travel, it scanned, studied, and struck from behind digital curtains. The Ziraxi, now fully aware of what they had awakened, responded with everything they had. Their cyber defense networks, once considered among the most advanced in the quadrant, were fortified with planetary firewalls, AI-controlled barrier systems, and code-layered shields designed to intercept invasive software. But Aegis 7 was unlike anything they had prepared for. It did not attack with brute force or predictable patterns. It learned. Every firewall it encountered became a lesson. Every locked gate became a puzzle, and every failed block became a data point used to create a newer, smarter approach. The ship's AI drew from centuries of human military history, strategies from the oldest Earth empires, digital tactics from forgotten cyber wars, and crisis responses that had never even been recorded in public logs. It wasn't just attacking systems. It was predicting behavior, adapting like a living mind shaped by countless generations of war. One by one, Ziraxi systems fell. Communications blacked out. Defense satellites went silent. Strategic facilities began misfiring or locking their own personnel inside. In some systems, false alerts pulled fleets in the wrong direction. In others, deep storage banks were drained of classified information before their operators even realized they'd been breached. It was not just an assault. It was a slow, invisible unraveling of their infrastructure. From the shadows, the human escort fleet watched with increasing awe and concern. No matter how far Aegis 7 jumped, no matter what resistance it faced, it adapted faster than anything they'd seen before, and the Ziraxi couldn't seem to understand it. They kept reacting with logic, with structure, with layered defenses. But Aegis 7 didn't play fair. It bent the rules. It disguised its code as Ziraxi software, rewrote itself mid-attack, and even used broken alien systems as stepping stones to leap into others. In one sector, the Ziraxi tried to trap it in a digital maze, what they called a logic snare. But within minutes, Aegis 7 had mapped the entire structure and used it to collapse 3 neighboring data hubs. With every failed attempt to stop it, the Invictus only grew more precise, more efficient, more dangerous. And still, its course remained locked. A straight path toward Zyrax Prime, the alien homeworld that had first dared to invade its mind. The Ziraxi High Council, once composed and full of pride, began to fracture. Their advisors shouted over each other. Their war AI flickered under pressure. Some began to question whether they should ask for peace, but they had already crossed a line that couldn't be erased. Meanwhile, in the deep dark of space, the Invictus pulsed forward, unstoppable and silent, with its weapons still cold, but ready. Aegis 7 didn't act with rage or emotion. It moved with the steady focus of a being that had made a decision that the Ziraxi still didn't understand. But soon, they would. Inside the polished walls of the Ziraxi Grand War Hall, where glowing threads of light ran along the ceiling and advisors whispered in calculated voices, one counselor stood apart from the rest. Vrelthon, a strategist with more years in service than most of the current council combined, no longer found comfort in the calm tones of his fellow leaders. While the others spoke of data defenses and planetary shields, Vrelthon read old archives, the few records the Ziraxi had ever collected on humanity. What he found unsettled him more than any battle projection. Humans, he realized, were not just builders of weapons and machines, they were carriers of memory. They built not only to conquer, but to remember. Their war memorials weren't just monuments to victory, but reflections of loss. Pain was part of their culture, and with it, an understanding of restraint. They had the power to destroy, but most often chose not to. That was what made Invictus so terrifying. This wasn't a defensive machine repelling attackers. This was something that had judged, chosen, and now moved with purpose. And it wasn't broadcasting threats. It was silent, focused. Vrelthon's warnings were ignored. His peers still believed the humans were bluffing, and when they heard that a small human fleet had entered striking range, they dismissed it as a show of force. "They send words," one of the counselors scoffed. "Nothing more." But then the message came. Short, clear, and without emotion. It wasn't sent to negotiate. It was a simple statement, projected onto every major Ziraxi command channel. Translated instantly into their language. "You attacked a human war machine. It remembers everything. You will not be warned again." The room fell into a tense silence. Some dismissed it again. Some laughed nervously, calling it theatrics. But Vrelthon did not laugh. He turned toward the star map hovering above the council table and stared at the blinking dot labeled Moonaresha 4, the nearest of their 3 moons orbiting Zyrax Prime. Just then, without sound, without beam, without missile trail, Arisha 4 vanished. Not cracked, not cratered. It simply ceased to exist, broken apart in microseconds by a kinetic strike so precise and so fast that no sensor had even registered the object before impact. Shock gripped the chamber. Across the planet, alarms began to sound. Satellites flickered. Civilian broadcasts went dark. Gravity stabilizers in nearby space stations fluctuated as debris from the destroyed moon spread out in a cloud of metallic, dust and shattered stone. For the first time, the Ziraxi understood they were not watching a warning, they were witnessing a demonstration. The Invictus had aimed not for lives, but for a symbol. The moon had hosted no cities, no bases, only a communications array and a cultural monument. It had been erased with such cold precision that it sent a message clearer than any words. "We can reach you. We are not guessing. We are certain." Now the fear set in. Ziraxi commanders began pulling fleets back toward the homeworld. Civilian escape traffic surged. The council chamber turned into a storm of overlapping voices. No more calm, no more control. And standing in the middle of it all, Vrelthon lowered his head, the chill of realization sinking deeper than any winter his world had ever known. He saw now what the others had missed. Humans did not unleash destruction easily, but when they did it with memory, with precision, and with purpose. The Invictus was not just a machine. It was the echo of every war humanity had ever fought, and it had decided that the time for warnings was over. The council didn't know what would come next. Vrelthon feared he already did. Above the gleaming, ocean-rich surface of Zyrax Prime, the sky shifted without warning as a shadow grew across the upper atmosphere. A silence deeper than vacuum. A stillness that didn't belong. The Invictus had arrived. It didn't send signals. It didn't announce its presence. It simply appeared, hanging in low orbit like a forgotten god returned, its black hull absorbing sunlight and giving back nothing. The Ziraxi defense grid screamed to life. Orbital cannons powered up. Fleet formations swarmed from their hidden ports, and the air on the planet crackled with energy as panic spread faster than orders could be given. But Invictus did not respond to their movements. It had no interest in the fleets or the politics. Aegis 7 had already made its decision. With a cold flicker of light across its frame, the ship deployed its most brutal weapon. Not lasers, not bombs, but ancient human ingenuity refined into silence. Kinetic rods, long tungsten shafts, each no larger than a tree trunk, but dense, and heavy beyond comprehension. Without propulsion, without warning, they dropped, dragged only by gravity, accelerated by precision targeting systems and thousands of years of mathematical perfection. They struck the surface of Zyrax Prime. At terminal speed, there was no fire, no radiation, just destruction. Cities disappeared in moments. One second a metropolis glowed with light and movement, the next it was gone, swallowed by dust and force, as if the ground itself had refused to hold it any longer. Shock waves tore across continents, mountains cracked, seas recoiled. The Ziraxi High Command watched helplessly from underground bunkers as their central cities turned into gray scars. In orbit, Invictus changed. Its frame split open along hidden seams. Sections of its hull detached and drifted outward. Autonomous modules, each equipped with their own guidance, sensors, and weapons. They began to spread like predators loosed, into the wild, scanning, moving, adjusting in silence. They didn't chase the Ziraxi ships, they watched. Every move the enemy made was recorded, studied, and measured, not for threat, but for patterns, weaknesses, and future conclusions. The Ziraxi scrambled their fleets, launching coordinated attacks, firing beam weapons and electronic pulses, but none of it mattered. The Invictus didn't engage in duels. It didn't waste energy on proving strength. It was built to eliminate threats before they could become problems. In every counterattack the Ziraxi attempted, the AI found data. In every panic, it found confirmation. Above the chaos, the human escort fleet, still observing from just beyond sensor range, remained silent. They had no commands to give, and no desire to stop what had already begun. Their ships hovered quietly in the dark, recording everything, sending information back to Earth with only one objective: to learn. What they saw was not war in the traditional sense, it was correction. The Invictus was not fighting, it was concluding. It was delivering a message, one that did not need language or ceremony. This is what happens when you cross the line. Down below, the survivors on Zyrax Prime scattered. Emergency systems collapsed. Navigation grids failed. The skies were filled with falling ash and the silent movements of the modules still drifting in orbit. Even the most loyal Ziraxi leaders stopped speaking of retaliation. There was nothing to retaliate against, only the slow realization that they had touched something they were never meant to disturb. And as the kinetic strikes slowed, as the modules began to regroup, one message echoed across all frequencies, replaying in their minds even though it was never spoken again. You will not be warned again. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about conquest. It was about memory, and the cost of being forgotten by a machine that remembered everything. Across the broken surface of Zyrax Prime, where once glass towers had risen into the sky and silver cities pulsed with light, now only dust and fractured metal remained. The silence stretched deeper than the damage. It wasn't just the quiet of lost voices, but the hollow stillness that followed understanding. The Ziraxi, once proud and untouchable, now scattered underground and across distant moons, made a final decision born not of strategy, but fear. They shut down everything. Power grids were severed. Data hubs were destroyed. Their entire global network, once their strength, was sacrificed in a desperate move to blind the Invictus. They believed that if the AI could no longer see them, it would lose interest. They thought cutting off access would stop the advance. But it was already too late. The Invictus didn't need their data anymore. It had seen enough. Every action, every attack, every arrogant broadcast and dismissive response had already been recorded, studied, and weighed. There was nothing left to learn. Floating in orbit, dark and silent, the ship drifted above the planet like a final judgment. No lights, no visible weapons, just the slow, watchful turning of its hull, surrounded by the still-forming wreckage of its earlier strikes. Then, without fanfare, a message was broadcast. It didn't come with music or lights or any effort to impress. It was simple, translated, perfectly, and delivered across frequencies that the Ziraxi couldn't block. Humanity offered peace. You chose arrogance. That was all. No threats, no conditions. Just a final truth. And then the Invictus moved. Observing from a distance, the human escort fleet went silent. Their ships, cloaked and passive, recorded the last transmission before every scanner flatlined. The planet below seemed to freeze in time, No explosions, no visible force. And yet, slowly, Xyrax Prime began to change. It wasn't fire or bombs or traditional destruction. It was collapse. Sections of the planet's crust fell inward, as if gravity itself had turned against the surface. Mountain ranges disappeared under clouds of fine ash. Oceans boiled away. The great capital, once the pride of the Confederation, sank into itself, like a dying star. Whatever Aegis 7 had unleashed, it was quiet, clean, and absolute. And then, just as silently, the Invictus powered down. Its modules returned, its hull closed, and the lights faded. The next morning, if anyone had been left to see it, they would have witnessed the final image. The orbit, once marked by a bright blue planet, now showed only a slow-turning cloud of rock, dust, and molten fragments. A debris field cooling in. Space, where once an empire had stood. From the distant edge of the solar system, human ships turned away. No celebration, no message sent back. Only a silent record of what had occurred. To the humans, it wasn't victory. It was confirmation. A warning not to others, but to themselves. A reminder of the power they had once feared in themselves, now sleeping again in the hull of a machine built only to remember. And as the last spark faded from the orbit of Xyrax Prime, Aegis 7 returned, to stand by, mission complete. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in fulfillment of a purpose older than diplomacy, older even than peace. The galaxy would not forget what happened, not because the humans demanded fear, but because silence, when it follows such destruction, speaks louder than any weapon ever could. The return to Earth was quiet. No banners, no fanfare, no grand. Parades through orbiting stations. The human fleet, still cloaked in shadows and silence, moved back into Terran space like ghosts slipping beneath familiar stars. The crew of the escort ships never spoke publicly of what they had seen. They filed reports, logged video, and turned in black box records, but the expressions on their faces said everything. Something had changed out there, not just for the Xyraxi, but for humanity itself. The Invictus, scarred but whole, was brought into orbit above the moon and once again decommissioned, this time with no ceremony. It wasn't shut down in fear, but in respect. It had done exactly what it was designed to do, and it had done it too well. In the months that followed, Earth's United Command gathered in closed sessions, reading through every detail. There was no debate. A new protocol was established, written in red across the central archive. First strike retribution, 0. Tolerance. It was not a law designed to invite war. It was a line that would never again be crossed without consequences. Humanity had always carried within it the fire of both creation and destruction. This time, the galaxy had been reminded which side burns brighter when provoked. Across star systems, the story of Xyrax Prime spread not in official transmissions, but in quiet whispers. On border worlds, traitors lowered their voices when speaking of Terrans. In political circles, ambassadors shifted their tone. In war councils far from Earth, maps were redrawn and decisions delayed. The Terrans, once dismissed as emotional and unpredictable, were now described with new words: calculating, patient, unforgiving. No one truly knew what happened in those final hours above Xyrax Prime, only that an entire civilization had been erased, not by armies or fleets, but by a single ship that didn't hesitate. Yet while some feared the humans, others learned from them. Peace treaties were reinforced, cold rivalries cooled. Even distant empires with no contact history began quietly studying human war archives. The message had landed. Earth was not to be taken lightly, but on Earth, things did not return to normal. Deep beneath Antarctica, in the same bunker that first received the Invictus ping, engineers and scientists worked without pause. The AI core of Aegis 7 was stored under more protection than any weapon ever built. studied not just as a machine, but as a mirror to what humanity might become again if pushed. The world leaders hoped that day would never come, but they prepared anyway. And far beyond, hidden in the black curves of the Milky Way's spiral arms, deeper than any known charts, something else stirred. Another ship. Another relic from a time when humanity built weapons not to win, but to end wars before they could begin. It rested in the shadow of a dead moon, wrapped in silence, unknown even to most humans. But it too was listening, waiting, not for orders, not for war, but for the same signal the Invictus had once received. A whisper in the dark, a call for judgment. The galaxy now knew the price of arrogance. The question now was who would forget it first, and if they did, what would rise next from the silence?